In Chapter 7, you will learn about the rise of direct action and renewed black-white conflict, the assimilation of African Americans in secondary and primary structures, affirmative action and its controversies, as well as African American success. In the video Awakenings 1954 to 1956, you watched as Rosa Parks was arrested in December of 1955 for refusing to give up her bus seat to a white person. The boycott you witnessed did not last just a few days. African Americans had to make a point. They went for broke, as Dr. King's wife stated in the video. They were not going to be given anything. They had to fight for all of it. It had to be fought peacefully. However, for many blacks, lives were lost. They were often met by mob violence, police dogs, arrests, and jail terms. That boycott lasted about a year. Dr. Martin Luther King was young. It gives me chills every time I watch that video. In 1957, he was instrumental in forming the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to promote nonviolent practices. In 1963, that was the year in which 250,000 people participated in the March on Washington. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which summarized the objective of the civil rights movement. Many blacks were not in agreement with the nonviolence philosophy. This was due to the increase of violence by whites on blacks. There was political pressure on Washington to make changes, to pass legislation prohibiting discrimination in voting, public accommodations, and facilities. President Johnson's support of President Kennedy's civil rights program was known as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Even after that legislation was passed, voting rights violations were being violated in the South. Martin Luther King Jr. led a nonviolent protest in Selma, Alabama, and shortly after that, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This provision suspended all literacy tests and authorized the federal government to place poll watchers in the southern states. That legislation officially marked the end of segregation. However, it did not end discrimination. Brown versus Topeka gave confidence to Black Americans that school segregation and other inequalities were coming to an end. However, whites resisted the court rulings any time they could get away with them. Blacks continued to react nonviolently. However, there were Black Americans that wanted some form of separation. The Lost Nation of Islam tried to take advantage of that sentiment. Malcolm X was a minister in a large Muslim temple, and he stressed the importance of blacks organizing to regain their self-respect and establish their power. Malcolm and his faction wanted to be separated from whites, and that territory would be payment for the enslavement that black slaves had endured while building America. In 1964, Malcolm left Elijah Muhammad and founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity. They advocated the use of defensive violence. In 1965, it seemed like all hell broke loose when police arrested a young black man for speeding and he failed a sobriety test. Rumors swirled that police had beaten the young man and his family. Consequently, rioting ensued. 34 people were killed, and over 600 buildings were damaged. Most belonged to blacks. There was an increase in riots and turmoil in 1966. Chicago and Cleveland were the two sites of the major chaos. Then, in 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. There was a decline in protests that year. Dr. King had stated, "Violence is not only morally repugnant, it is pragmatically barren." The 70s and the 80s showed some decline in civil rights activities, which might be attributed to the global economic conditions and the war. However, there were three major incidents in Miami that renewed the black and white conflict. Those incidents exploded into major riots. These and other events served as reminders that there were still racial problems that had not been solved. In 1991, the beating of Rodney King returned them to national prominence. Whites felt that the beating was an irregularity. However, blacks viewed it as a reflection of the racism that still exists in America today. 4 years after the Rodney King trial, the O.J. Simpson not guilty verdict's reaction seemed to be shaped by race. Whites seemed to believe he was guilty. However, the largely black jury and most blacks believed otherwise. The racial conflicts that we read about definitely showed that the lengthy path that blacks have been through since the early 1600s have not given way to the different ideologies of assimilation. Many black Americans feel that they have not achieved equality as citizens. The Rodney King and O.J. Simpson events, as well as others, show the perceived racial unfairness that seemed to be prevalent in law enforcement. Harvard professor Randall Kennedy, in his book Race, Crime, and the Law, talks about racial profiling. Racial profiling takes place when police or other authorities use a person's race to subject that person to questioning, searching, or greater levels of investigation. Racial profiling is a severe form of racial discrimination, and people are unaware or reluctant to respond to the harm that it can cause. In 1994, Denny's restaurant chain was ordered to pay millions of dollars to black customers who were discriminated against. The U.S. Labor Department settled the largest race discrimination suit brought by government workers. Texaco reached an out-of-court settlement because executives were tape recorded using racial slurs toward minority employees. There is evidence that old-fashioned racism has been replaced by modern racism. Many African Americans believe that the improvements of the 1960s have been corroded. Let's take a look at African American assimilation. For blacks, they did not have any desire to travel to America to start a new life. The slaves refused to accept cultural assimilation. They had little choice. Black Americans succeeded in building a culture based on their African roots. However, the current problems that black Americans face can be attributed to the cruel conditions of slavery. In 1965, sociologist Daniel Moynihan, in his report, the Moynihan Report, stated that the fabric of Negro society and the Negro family were deteriorating. He wanted the government to take action. From his point of view, the social problems of black Americans were the result of blacks to take advantage of opportunities instead of their lack of taking advantage of opportunities instead of the majority's failure to expand opportunities. Opponents of the report suggested that cultural strains have protected the black family through the devastating effects of slavery and through the unemployment patterns of black males. It appears that black Americans have acted in response over time by building a strong culture based on the experiences of the past and also the present-day events. As a way to counteract the negative images of blacks, especially black males, Minister Louis Farrakhan organized the Million Man March in 1995. It was to celebrate the majority of black men who work hard, support their families, and contribute to their communities. The march did raise a few issues, that of separatism within the community, namely that it did exclude black females and whites. Let's take a look at secondary structural assimilation. African Americans have moved in many ways, important ways, toward the goal of full secondary assimilation. However, there are still gaps that exist between the levels of whites and blacks in areas of jobs, income, education, and housing. Whites are still concentrated in the better paying jobs. Racial employment differences can be credited to regional differences, and blacks are usually employed in lower positions of pay. Blacks are being displaced by automation, such as in the auto industry, where mechanical robots are used to build cars rather than manpower. For blacks, they are unemployed, underemployed, and if they are working, they are being paid substandard wages. Incomes have increased since the 1950s. However, large gaps exist between blacks and whites. Education is the medium to fight racist beliefs. Another important sign of the changes occurring for blacks in America is the extent in which blacks live in residential areas. Blacks continue to live in central cities, and whites seem to flee. White flight out to the suburban areas around the cities. There are practices that keep them in those areas. They include discriminatory practices by banks and lending institutions, intimidation and violence towards blacks looking for housing in white neighborhoods, federally sponsored public housing, and suburban strategies to keep blacks away from those areas. Most whites support black opportunities or opportunities for blacks to move into their neighborhoods. However, whites do not move into predominantly black neighborhoods. Most people believe that blacks will not soon achieve equality with whites. Black and white relations in the United States seem to be changing. Many interactions that were at one time illegal now happen with little remark. Swimming, dancing, dating, mixed schools, public transportation, and even sports team. Increasing diversity in the United States has seen a drop in the number of white students in many schools and a rise in multiracial populations, especially increasing numbers in Hispanics and Asians. Interracial marriage, especially of blacks and whites, has long been the subject of interest. Laws have complicated things. In 1967, the Supreme Court ruled that laws prohibiting interracial marriages were unconstitutional. At that time, 16 states still had those laws. Studies indicate that outmarriages among blacks have been less common than outmarriages among other racial and ethnic groups. Black and white intermarriages went up quickly during the 1960s, then doubled in the 1980s and 90s. The declining pool of black males who are eligible to marry partners outside has resulted in more black families that have a woman as a head of household. Let's take a look at the affirmative action debate. Affirmative action is a policy designed to improve racial and ethnic disadvantage. In 1961, President Kennedy established Executive Order 10925, which stated that the government would encourage equal opportunity for all qualified persons through positive measures. Affirmative action grew through various actions by presidents, Congress, and the courts. It was expanded to most social institutions. There were some early challenges in the courts, namely the University of California versus Bakke in 1978 and Griggs versus Duke Power Company in 1971. In the 1980s and the 90s, affirmative action came under attack from whites that claimed that it unfairly discriminated against them. Some people find affirmative action to be wrong. Others find it to be crucial, especially to right some wrong practices. To get around affirmative action, some states implemented percent plans. In some states, they admit the top 10% of eligible students to their state universities. Some opponents, including black people, claim that affirmative action has gotten in the way of progress for black Americans. African American success, the cultural view, tends to assume that differences in worldly success among ethnic groups are explained mainly by differences in the effort the group members put into a job. The advocates of the structural view focus on worldly success to non-cultural factors. Such factors include the level of discrimination a group has faced or now faces, when they arrived in the United States, where they now reside, the economy, and the type of skills they come with. The social class analysis focuses on socioeconomic standings. Sociologist William Wilson argued that race as a factor affecting socioeconomic status was shrinking, and that the life chances of blacks had more to do with their socioeconomic status than their day-to-day meetings with white people. There are many questions concerning the success of African Americans that are still unanswered. The voluntary immigrants to the United States since 1965 challenges the three-generational theory. They come from the Caribbean, Haiti, countries in Africa speaking French, English, and other languages. They enter the country under the immigrant preference with select jobs and education above the average resident. These immigrants are still categorized racially in the United States. Mary Waters, a sociologist at Harvard University, found that first-generation black immigrants distanced themselves from American blacks. She also found that white employers preferred them over American blacks because they were less confrontational. Kazanitz, in 1992, found that there was job competition between blacks born in America and blacks born outside the country. Other tensions have also been discovered. Increasing immigration from other areas of the world raises new questions. At the end of this chapter, 2 questions. If you were asked to suggest social measures or interventions to increase or decrease the speed of African American assimilation, what would you suggest and why? And the second question, is affirmative action a form of reverse discrimination?